The valley had once been green. In the spring, the grass used to ripple like an emerald sea, and wildflowers dotted the meadows in bursts of yellow, white, and violet. Shepherds would lead their flocks along winding footpaths, and the smell of freshly tilled earth would carry on the breeze. Its hills rolled gently under a sky so wide and blue it seemed impossible for darkness to ever touch it. But the war had a way of remaking things. By the second year, the grass was gone, scorched to brittle straw or churned into black mud by the constant shelling. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and damp earth, and the rivers, once so clear you could see pebbles glittering at the bottom, now ran thick with silt, ash, and sometimes worse. The cheerful clatter of carts on the main road had been replaced by the distant thud of artillery, the occasional whine of mortar shells, and the eerie silence that followed each bombardment. It was hard to imagine anyone had ever lived here. Harder still to believe that only a few seasons ago, children had been playing in these fields, their laughter carried on the wind. Now the same wind carried smoke. Private Thomas Whitaker crouched low behind the crumbling remains of a stone wall. The rocks were icy under his gloves, their sharp edges digging into his palms. He pressed his Lee-Enfield rifle against his chest, not because he was ready to fire, but because the weight of it felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to in the chaos. The winter wind cut through his wool uniform as if it weren't there, finding every gap, every seam, biting into his skin with invisible teeth. His breath came out in clouds, hanging briefly before being torn away by the cold. But it wasn't the weather that made his hands shake. Somewhere beyond the ridge ahead, enemy snipers were waiting, watching. They could be anywhere, behind the twisted skeletons of burnt trees, peering from the shattered windows of old farmhouses, hidden in the folds of the hills. The moment he raised his head above the wall, there was a chance he'd never lower it again. A shadow shifted beside him, and Sergeant Arthur Marlowe crouched down, his boots sinking into the frozen earth. The older man moved with a kind of wary precision, every motion measured, every step considered. His face was carved with deep lines, not all of them from age. Lines of weariness, worry, and too many winters spent in places like this. His eyes never stopped scanning the ridgeline, sharp and alert despite the cold that turned his breath to mist. "Stay low," Marlowe hissed, his voice just loud enough for Thomas to hear over the faint whistle of the wind. Thomas gave a short nod, though he wasn't entirely sure the sergeant was looking at him. His heart was beating so hard he could hear the pulse in his ears, a heavy thud-thud-thud that seemed far too loud for a battlefield. He imagined the sound echoing across the valley, drawing the attention of every hidden marksman. 19. He was only 19 years old. Just last winter, he had been walking the cobbled streets of his hometown, delivering fresh loaves from the family bakery. His biggest concern had been getting the right coins back into a customer's hand and making sure the bread stayed warm until he reached their doorstep. The smell of yeast and the warmth of the ovens had been his world. The most dangerous thing he had faced then was an icy pavement after frost. But that life felt impossibly far away now, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The call to enlist had seemed like something noble, something worth doing. He'd seen the posters, bold, colorful, filled with words like duty, honor, and glory. Friends from the village had signed up, laughing and joking about adventure and the chance to see the world. It had all seemed like a great story waiting to happen. Now, crouched in the ruins of a nameless farm, his fingers numb around his rifle, Thomas couldn't remember the last time anything about this felt like an adventure. The posters hadn't shown the way the cold seeped into your bones, or the sound a man made when he realized he'd been shot, or the way silence could feel heavier than gunfire. A gust of wind rattled the loose stones in the wall. Somewhere far off, the boom of artillery rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Thomas ducked lower without thinking, every muscle in his body tensing. "Eyes forward," Marlowe murmured, still scanning. "They'll wait until we think it's safe." The sergeant had that calm authority that didn't come from rank alone. Men listened to him not just because they had to, but because they knew he'd been through it all before. There was a steadiness in his voice, even in moments like this, that kept panic at bay. Thomas shifted slightly, his knee protesting from the cold ground. He peered through a narrow gap in the wall, letting his eyes adjust to the dull gray light. The ridge ahead was dusted with frost, the outline of trees standing bare and skeletal against the sky. No movement. No shapes. Nothing to give away where the enemy lay. That was the danger. The valley looked empty, dead, even, but it wasn't. Somewhere in that stillness, someone was watching him. Someone had their rifle already aimed. He swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. He thought about his mother. She would be in the bakery now, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her apron. The ovens would be glowing, and the smell of bread would fill the narrow shop. She'd probably hum to herself without realizing it, the same tune she always did when she needed dough. His little sister, Clara, would be at school, her laughter probably echoing down the corridors between lessons. He wondered if they thought of him now, crouched behind a wall in a place where the cold felt like a living thing. "Whitaker," Marlowe said quietly. Thomas turned his head slightly. "When the signal comes," the sergeant continued, "you keep your head down until I tell you otherwise. Understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." Marlowe studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good lad." Another boom echoed in the distance, this one closer. Thomas felt the vibration through the ground, a reminder that the war was never far away. It was always just over the next hill, just around the next bend. The two of them waited there in the frozen stillness, the ruined valley stretching out ahead like a graveyard. Somewhere, a bird cried out, sharp and lonely. Thomas adjusted his grip on his rifle, his gloves stiff with cold, and tried to push away the fear that sat like a weight in his chest. The war would move forward soon enough. It always did. And when it did, so would they. That morning had begun with a pale, colorless dawn, the kind that crept slowly over the frost-covered fields and offered no warmth. The cold seemed to settle into the bones, a constant companion on the long march. Their breath hung in the air as faint clouds, quickly torn away by the breeze that swept across the open ground. Word had come down from headquarters before sunrise. Their unit was to push forward and take control of Varden Hollow, once a peaceful village tucked between the hills, now just another scar on the map. Intelligence reported that the enemy had been using its bell tower as an observation post, a high perch from which they could spot and harass Allied movements for miles around. Varden Hollow had been charming once. The old photographs that some of the older men remembered showed neat stone houses with slate roofs, gardens climbing with roses, and a market square that bustled every Saturday. But the war had erased much of that. Half the roofs had been blown apart by shellfire, and jagged holes gaped where windows had once let in the morning light. The cobbled streets were cracked and littered with rubble, the village's beauty reduced to a silent ruin. The approach had been brutal. As they moved through the frozen fields, the air suddenly tore open with the howl of incoming mortar fire. The ground erupted in fountains of soil and ice, flinging jagged shards of frozen mud into the air. Men dropped flat where they could, hugging the ground as shrapnel whined past. Corporal Henry Renshaw was the first to go down. A jagged piece of metal caught him in the leg, and he collapsed with a cry that carried above the din of the explosions. Two others fell soon after, one clutching his arm, the other struggling to breathe as the medics scrambled to reach them. Even once the shelling eased, the echoes of those shouts seemed to follow Thomas, looping again and again in his head like a cruel reminder. Now, what remained of the section was gathered in the shelter of a low ridge just beyond the village outskirts. The six of them crouched among frost-stiff grass and frozen clumps of earth, their rifles resting across their knees. The distant smell of smoke carried on the wind. Somewhere ahead, a burst of machine gun fire rattled briefly before falling silent again. Sergeant Arthur Marlowe knelt beside Thomas, his gloved hands resting on the stock of his rifle. "Command thinks there's a machine gun nest near the bell tower," he said quietly, eyes never leaving the cluster of ruined buildings ahead. "If we don't take that out, the rest of the platoon won't stand a chance when they move in." Thomas felt the muscles in his throat tighten. "And we're the ones who?" Marlowe's mouth twisted into the faintest hint of a grim smile. "Yeah. The wind carried another faint rattle of gunfire from somewhere deep in the village. Thomas adjusted his grip on his rifle, the wood cold beneath his fingers. Whatever lay ahead, there would be no turning back once the signal came. When the signal came, a sharp whistle through the cold air. The men moved. They slipped from cover to cover, their boots crunching in snow. The silence was deceptive. Varden Hollow looked abandoned at first glance. Smoke drifted lazily from a collapsed roof, and an old cart lay overturned in the street. Halfway down the main road, the illusion shattered. Gunfire erupted from the bell tower, the staccato bursts echoing between the stone buildings. Bullets ricocheted off walls and tore through the air around them. Thomas dove into a doorway, heart hammering in his ears. Suppressing fire. Marlowe shouted, returning fire toward the tower. Thomas raised his rifle, aimed at the faint outline of movement in the upper window, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted his shoulder. Whether he hit anything, he couldn't tell. The firing from the tower continued relentlessly. They were pinned down. Moving forward meant running straight into the machine gun's line of fire. That's when Private James Lorne, their youngest besides Thomas, crawled over with a plan. "There's an alley on the left that leads to the back of the tower," Lorne said breathlessly. "If we can get through without being spotted, we might be able to flank them." It was risky, but they didn't have many options. Marlowe chose Thomas and Lorne for the job. The two slipped into the alley, their breath visible in the frigid air. The ground was littered with debris, broken glass, bricks, even a child's toy truck half buried in snow. The sight made Thomas's stomach tighten. People had lived here. Children had played here. Halfway down the alley, a shot rang out. The wall beside Thomas exploded into dust. "A sniper!" "Down!" Lorne yelled, dragging Thomas behind a pile of rubble. They couldn't see where the sniper was, but they knew one thing. Moving now would be suicide. For what felt like hours, they remained frozen in place, pressed against the icy rubble as if the stones themselves could shield them from death. Neither Thomas nor Private James Lorne dared move more than an inch. Their breath came in shallow, controlled bursts, each exhale forming a faint mist that was snatched away by the cold. Somewhere above and ahead, an enemy sniper waited, patient and unseen, turning the alley into a killing ground. Thomas's thoughts began to drift unbidden. He saw his mother's kitchen in perfect detail, the warm glow of the oil lamp, the steady rhythm of her hands kneading dough, the comforting scent of bread baking in the oven. He could almost hear the creak of the old floorboards beneath his boots and, faintest of all, the sweet peal of his little sister Clara's laughter as she dashed in from the cold, cheeks flushed, asking for the first slice from the loaf. The images were so vivid they made his chest ache. They felt like a cruel joke, memories too bright for a place so cold and gray. A sharp burst of static broke the stillness, followed by Sergeant Marlowe's voice in their earpieces, low but steady. "Snipers down. You're clear to move." Relief came in a rush, though neither man allowed it to slow them. They pushed forward at once, boots crunching over glass and splintered wood as they slipped through the rest of the alley. The passage spat them out into a narrow courtyard hemmed in by high, battle-scarred walls. Above them, the air shook with the roar of the machine gun in the bell tower. Each burst rattled the windows and echoed across the square, the sound a constant, punishing reminder that their mission was far from over. There was only one way up, a narrow wooden staircase winding around the inside of the tower. Every step groaned under their weight. Thomas could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins, sharpening every sound, every breath. Halfway up, Lorne stopped and held a finger to his lips. Voices. The enemy soldiers were speaking in a language Thomas didn't understand, but their tone was clear, they were confident. Lorne nodded once, and they moved. Bursting into the upper room, Thomas fired before the enemy could react. One soldier went down immediately. Another spun toward them, reaching for his weapon, but Lorne tackled him to the ground. The fight was brutal and short. When it was over, the machine gun was silent. From the top of the tower, Thomas could see the entire valley. Smoke curled from distant fires. In the streets below, their platoon was moving in, securing the area. It should have felt like victory, but all Thomas felt was exhaustion. Marlowe joined them in the tower. "Good work," he said gruffly. "You saved lives today." Thomas nodded, but he wasn't sure. Every life saved seemed to come at the cost of another. That night, they camped in the Hollow's largest intact building, the old schoolhouse. The chalkboard still had faint writing on it, lessons abandoned mid-sentence when the war came. Lorne sat beside Thomas, cleaning his rifle. "Think it'll end soon?" he asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He thought of the valley, the green hills now blackened, the rivers turned to mud. He thought of the sniper's bullet that had almost ended him, and the soldiers in the tower who never made it out. "I hope so," Thomas said finally. "But hope doesn't change much out here." 2 days later, a letter arrived for Thomas. The handwriting was his mother's. She wrote about the bakery, about how the flour shipments were late because of the war, about his sister's school recitals. She never mentioned fear, but Thomas could read it between the lines. At the bottom, she'd written, "Come home safe." That's all that matters. He folded the letter carefully and kept it in his breast pocket. The orders came at dawn. They were to move deeper into enemy territory, toward the industrial city of Brackensport. As they marched, Thomas looked back at Varden Hollow. It was theirs now, but it didn't feel like a place reclaimed. It felt like a graveyard that would never be at peace. He wondered if, after the war, people would return. If children would laugh in the streets again. Or if the valley would remain just another scar on the land. The wind picked up, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. The war was far from over. And Thomas, like so many others, would keep moving forward, because stopping wasn't an option.